All right, this has been a long day, but I feel good. I'm completely jazzed by the discussion today. The B Senators are going to the Calder Cup Finals. I'm wearing my one Saul Stern tie. And the planning committee for this event was brave enough to trust me as the role of facilitator, the mad emailer from City Hall facilitating the final discussion. So those of you from outside the area, that's an inside joke, sorry. Before we get to some of the questions, I just want to touch on a couple items here. Is that this was done primarily by committee, by consensus. There was an incredible amount of work that went into this from some really committed folks that have been doing this work for quite some time. I just want to read their names very quickly. Mark Bowers and Zach McKenna from DOT. Marissa Lamphere, maybe if we can hold and give them all applause at the end. Marissa Lamphere and Mary McFadden from the Department of Health, County. Eric Jensen from WSKG. Jane DeHawkers from the community and former past. Tom Evans from Southern Tier East Regional Planning Development Board. Dave Curry, who helped in initial stages from Brisk. And of course, Caroline and Amelia LaDolce from the city. So just amazing group to work with. So I basically had no choice because it was my job to do this. I don't know if you've met my boss, our mayor. We don't say he has a temper, we just say he has very impassioned, persuasive skills. That's the way we call it. So about a year ago, the city finished a year-long commission report, and there are 4 commissions actually. One was the Commission on Sustainable Development and Smart Growth. Some folks in this room who have actually continued work through the Alliance were instrumental in that. And it was deliberations for over a year, and they put together an incredible recommendation package. And one of them was on land use, initiate and encourage discussion at a regional level on adoption of smart growth and sustainable development principles. So when I took over the department, the mayor pulled me in his office and he handed me this. He said, okay, I think you're busy for the next few years. You know, this was the kind of the work that we're doing and why the city has played a role in this effort. But it's been easy because there's so much great work going on. I think one of the things I did want to mention is that, you know, if you look at where we are and where we're going, and we'll be able to address some of the panelists, we have some of the same problems that Onondaga mentioned. You could have pulled out Onondaga, put in Broome County, taken out Syracuse and put in Binghamton. It would have been exactly the same. But there's a lot of reason, I think, to remain positive. If you look at some of our planning efforts at a regional level, the Binghamton Metropolitan Transportation Study, which has shown excellent leadership on this, has made investing in urban core a priority in 2005. They expanded this, recognizing that our village centers are also instrumental and an important way that we can be consistent with smart growth. There's the Greenway Plan, a major recreational asset along our waterway corridors that cross county jurisdictions. There's the Southern Tier East Regional Planning Development Board and the Southern Tier Central Regional Planning Development Board that's working right now on a Susquehanna-Chemung action plan. So a lot of collaboration, a lot of regionalism. You look at the county in the agricultural plan in 2001, it mentioned smart growth, protect our farmland. In 2002, the BC plan, it mentioned smart growth, ways to incentivize and restore economic vitality to our region. 2006, Aging Future Partnerships came up with a BC livability plan. This isn't new to our region. We have all the resources. We have, I think, all the assets. What we need to do is just integrate this efforts at a truly regional level and find out ways that we can then translate that into policy and reform, similar to the incredible leadership we see up at Onondaga County. Very impressive. So I'm going to throw these questions out here. Some of them are directed specifically to folks, others aren't. As you know, New York State is rated as one of the most business unfriendly states in the country. Has the implementation of smart growth development been more successful in more business friendly states? And I see some other variations of this, just how does this apply? It's almost as if we have to figure out how to do smart decline. If anyone could speak to that.
Well, I'll start from an advocacy point of view. Even the smart growth law that Paul went into some detail in describing is not new regulation. Essentially, it's very clear instructions to state agencies to really think through carefully how they're spending the public's money so that the public gets the highest return on its investment. I can't think of any better expression from a business point of view. Use your tax money wisely, get a good return.
Okay.
I also think that, at least certainly the development sector, what they really crave is certainty and predictability. And so to the degree that localities or the state can send clear signals about this is what we want, and we are making the investments to make that viable, and we are going to try to smooth the way for you to follow along when you're trying to come with us. That I think is entirely business friendly. I mean, it is really a proactive attempt to get a better partnership and better alignment between the public and private sector. And that means not only sort of looking at your infrastructure investments, but then also looking at your rules and codes. I mean, I can't tell you the number of counties and cities I've gone to where they say, we want smart growth, and then you look in their zoning and it's all single use, or it's all strip development for business along the arterial, and you sort of wonder why, if you want it so much, why it's so illegal. So I think there are a couple places that we need to be looking in making it business friendly, but I think that should be, when the community can express this is the direction we want to go for quality of life, for job creation, for economic development, and we're going to put our money where our mouth is, make it easier for the private sector to follow you.
I have a follow-up to that then. You mentioned that a lot of the development that would be consistent with smart growth is illegal. And I remember at the Smart Growth Conference, one developer said, I'm tired of breaking the law. Obviously, there are form-based codes that would allow for smart growth or promote and incentivize smart growth development. But changing a municipal zoning code is a huge challenge. Does anyone have examples of maybe a community that went through that process and how it was successful? Because both in the city's commission plan as well as the draft Susquehanna and Chemung action plan, they specifically mentioned that as a target, a 5-year goal, get one community to move their zoning code to a form-based code. So does anyone have maybe best practices example?
We haven't gotten that far yet, but we're on the path. And let me just speak to the stormwater program, and I'll turn it over to Megan because she probably knows more about it than I do. But what we've run into with the green infrastructure program in the city is that, similar to what we just heard, is that everybody's for it until they're not. And they're not when the code says, oh, you can't do porous pavement sidewalks in the city of Syracuse because the ordinance doesn't allow it. And one of the challenges we face is that the city, we are working in close partnership with them, and they've been tremendous, but we were told at the outset that zoning was off limits. So we're working on a stormwater ordinance right now, but we have not had success on zoning. I think we will ultimately, because some of the absurdity of the zoning is very apparent to us. When somebody wants to invest in a building in one of our lowest median household income census tracts and put a restaurant in, and they're told by the city that they have to build a 24-space parking lot next door, and we don't have the stormwater ordinance passed yet, so they can do an impervious parking lot. They just need to build it, even though there's plenty of on-street parking because nobody really goes to that community, but that's the rules. The roadblocks are much more acute and apparent, and we can address them because now we know that was a problem. We got a variance for that individual, and we're starting to have some success, but zoning is still off limits.
Yeah, we actually tried back in 2000, 2001. We brought in Andreas Dewani, who was at the forefront of the new urbanist, neo-traditional development, form-based code movement. And he came in and he laid out a regional planning framework for communities. He laid out a model ordinance to do form-based codes. He laid out all of those principles ingrained in form-based codes to try and introduce our communities to that. And we tried to roll that out to communities, and it was extremely difficult. It was way too big of an endeavor for these communities to really understand and embrace and be able to make that wholesale change from one to the other. We've had a couple communities that have really grabbed on. We have a lakefront development area in the city of Syracuse who has adopted the form-based code. They're actually using that transect developed within the settlement plan and from the form-based code, and it's working somewhat well. It's a transitional area, so there's some tweaks that need to be made to it. But if you want to talk about how we put that into place and how that's going and what some of the issues are, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that. Some of our hamlets, Hamlet of Brewerton up in the town of Cicero, just worked with a consultant to put form-based codes into place for its redevelopment area. But for the most part, we've actually been working with communities, and communities have been putting into place pieces of it, taking the principles and applying those within their existing framework, whether it's using an overlay district, whether it's easing up on their parking requirements, whether it's getting rid of setback requirements. So sort of nickel and diming away at some of the real major issues in their codes instead of that wholesale change. But we're getting there. We're trying. Just to speak, to the developers and the predictability issue. We actually met with a couple developers in the city of Syracuse. They were wondering how they could improve their codes, and we met with developers and said, okay, which codes in Onondaga County do you actually prefer over another? Which ones do you like? And they chose the more prescriptive, the more restrictive codes in our community because they knew exactly what they were expected to do, and it made their jobs a lot easier, and we thought that was really interesting.
I was just going to say the same thing about using overlays as a tool so that you don't have to do the entire city or town or whatever. And we've seen some. I'm actually from Peoria, Illinois originally, and DPZ went and did an entire sort of comprehensive master plan for the downtown there, which was great because it set a framework, like you said, and set a vision for making some pretty significant changes there. But then afterwards, they identified, other people came in. Jeff Farrell, who does a lot of form-based code work, went in and did smaller district level planning, right? And I think that's one way to get that done. We're also seeing that in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. We're actually working with the Shaker Village up there, but Pittsfield has done an arts overlay district in their downtown. I don't think it's a form-based code, but it's another example of an overlay. And then one thing going back to the pro-business idea and investment, I was in Oklahoma City last week, and it was like completely surprising how totally interesting it was there to me, and it was completely based on my own ignorance. So, but what I found fascinating there is that this is a city that's over the last 10 or 12 years has levied a sales tax on themselves to do massive amounts of public infrastructure investment to the tune of almost $2 billion. And they're on their third round, and they're going to raise $750 million to do all these sort of pointed sort of specific infrastructure projects, right? So they built a canal. They're doing a huge $180 million streetscape infrastructure improvement project. They're going to put a trolley in, and so. But what was fascinating was that there was all this investment, but when you actually asked some questions about how they were strategically linked, or how they were going to be leveraged, as far as what do you expect the outcome of these projects to be from an economic and community development standpoint, there was never really an answer, because what was happening there was they're incredibly pro-business there, and they're really good at sort of identifying the project, and then great engineers sort of focusing down, project managing it. We've got the money, let's build it, let's get it done, let's move on. Our success is that we built it. But they have not developed a strategic, larger framework for leveraging those investments. And so when you go and ask them about their zoning code, and are you doing things in your ordinance that would help facilitate smart growth in your downtowns, there's sort of a blank, but we're investing all this money. It's well, maybe you need to do some of this other stuff too. So it's not just business, pro-business, it's not just public investment, it's also having this the infrastructure in place to attract that kind of development.
Just one more comment on that. I think a lot of places have been very successful when they sort of do a build-out under their current regulations, when they sort of do a theoretical build-out, that a lot of people see that and don't actually like what the plan is, and that is often an impetus for making some change. So that's, I think, the other. And, you know, Doug Foy, who was the kind of Uber secretary for smart growth in Massachusetts, he used to just run around Massachusetts saying, you know, we all love Northampton. We couldn't build Northampton in Northampton again. It's illegal. You know, Northampton is now illegal in Northampton. And that sort of, you know, highly identifiable place that lots of people relate to and like, the notion that you couldn't even do that again when it's so desirable just strikes people as sufficiently absurd that it becomes clear you should do something different.
I'm going to talk on the visioning process. There are a couple questions on that. A transition is that it seems that the planning process and talking more about the outcomes, I know Mark mentions this specifically. Let's talk about the outcomes. We want a healthier public. We want a more cost-effective, you know, government, and continuing along that, and then backpedaling into, well, that if that's what we want, then how do we do that? Well, that's the visioning process. So there's some questions here about, you know, where can municipalities or counties secure funds, given there seems to be fewer and fewer resources that are being passed down. And I thought maybe if, Jeff, you could talk about a little bit more about the Partnership for Sustainable Communities and how that allowed some communities similar to, or regions similar to us, where we don't technically have a regional plan that integrates all those functions, but they were able to secure some funds through the new partnership programs.
Yeah, last year HUD had $150 million and DOT had about $600 million in the Tiger program. The HUD grants were in particular a great impetus for a lot of localities to really form up in their sort of formally join together as a region who hadn't in the past, and go after that money for specific projects that they thought would help them move away from the status quo and do some of the hard thinking that they hadn't been able to do without sort of an infusion of resources to be able to do that. This year, that money was under real threat in the last round of budget discussions, and frankly, we did a lot of lobbying on it and sort of made the case that this was exactly the kind of money that communities need to be able to make the arguments I made earlier. And so there's $100 million this year. I believe the RFP is going to be coming out relatively soon. And it's, I think that's a great place to look. For specific transportation projects, there is, as I said, a rural set-aside for the $550 million or whatever this year's allotment of Tiger money is out of DOT. And then EPA actually offers technical assistance grants that are at a much lower level, but I think pretty effective as well. So those are three of the places that are readily available, and I think are looking for exactly these kinds of projects. I will say this discussion about whether this is a resource that should be available at the federal level for communities is going to come up again. And it really, the program and the money was saved and put in there because Congress heard from people like you saying, this is a real thing. This isn't just some Washington program. This is communities trying to figure out their future. We need these resources, and they're going to pay back, significantly if you leave them in there. And we're about to have that same fight again because Congress was so far behind on the last budget that we now have to do the next one. So if you are interested in helping with that, please contact me because it really made a big difference to hear from localities who think this is valuable.
Okay, I was afraid this topic was going to come up, so I'm going to preface it a bit. We're dealing with three global crises. We have an energy crisis, we have an economic crisis, and we have an environmental crisis. And the old adage is think globally, act locally, plan regionally, is the new tagline that's been on to that. And if you think about it, the global economic crisis has manifested itself clearly here in our region. The global energy crisis is manifesting itself both in the dramatic increase in gas cost, as well as the prospect of massive industrial activity in the Marcellus Shale, the gas shale drilling. And the environmental crisis has manifested itself in a dramatic redrawing of the flood maps, the 100-year flood maps. In the city of Binghamton, about 15% of our parcels are going to be newly impacted if the draft plans hold. These are parcels all along our riverways where we've invested in recreational assets. So dramatic impacts at a regional level. So, with all that being said, I tried to smooth it there a little. What will the future gas drilling in upstate New York mean to smart growth planning? And there were 3 questions related to that. So that was the simplest. Does anyone want to take that on?
You're recording this, aren't you? This is being recorded, though?
Should we shut off the cameras?
Well, no, it's right here, and I know it's even more of a immediate issue. I know the Southern Tier in particular is under siege from the gas companies, and we're all awaiting the state's generic environmental impact statement to come out and give us some guidance on where we go from here. And I think that that's been a very healthy process at the state level, and we're looking forward to some guidance from them. But at the same time, talking about this just abstractly with the boss and others is, we have to answer the question of where do we want to be? If we want energy independence, the answer isn't solar and wind, I don't think. That's a personal opinion. I'm not speaking for the administration. I don't think solar and wind is the solution to getting off of foreign oil. Perhaps natural gas is part of that solution if we do it smartly, if we do it differently than they've done it in Pennsylvania. And I'm anxiously awaiting what the DEC's guidance will be on that. I think in Onondaga County, we're going to take steps to ban the disposal of frac fluid until such time that we know what's in it. And then after we know what's in it, we might continue that ban based upon the fact that municipal wastewater treatment systems probably shouldn't treat, not knowing exactly what's in it, though. I can't make that definitive decision. But as I understand in Pennsylvania now, it's not lawful to dispose of frac fluid in municipal systems, and that's probably a good decision. So there's a healthy discussion going on, and it's too bad that it's so polarizing at this point, particularly in New York, because we have a ways to go. I don't think any permits have been issued at this point, and there's probably going to be some time until some are, but we want to be a participant in that discussion, particularly from the aspect of potential economic development, from a smart growth perspective, the investment that can come with it for road improvements, smart road improvements, and also the jobs that come with it are very hard to shy away from, particularly I know in the Southern Tier where the economic impact has been prolonged. So that's my 2 cents, personally.
Multi-billion-dollar industry, and all we get are 2 cents, huh? Okay.
An investment.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll just bring up, as it has been very polarizing, the discussion, it seems both sides have been trying more to just debunk and delegitimate the other. There seemed to be one consistent, sane voice in that, and it was our Assemblywoman who kept saying, plan. Use the time to plan. And so if anything, I think it speaks again to the importance of regional planning, because this is going to have a dramatic regional impact. One question about, I mentioned this earlier, but just want to hear it specifically. What do the panelists think about planned retreat strategies? So smart decline, similar to what's happening in Gary and Detroit.
I'll comment on that a little bit because it's a very real thing in New York. Buffalo used to have 620,000 people. It's already down to 260,000. So its percentage population loss makes it right up there with Flint, Michigan, and Youngstown, Ohio, and Gary is, the leader in just the wrong thing. Rochester, under then Mayor Duffy, now Lieutenant Governor Duffy, recognized that it had lost 35% of its population, but because of the heavy job losses associated with Kodak, which once had 60,000 jobs in the Rochester area, having gone down to 9,000. Not to mention Xerox and Bausch & Lomb also shrinking dramatically. Rochester has vast industrial properties that are vacant and abandoned, and suggesting of something needs to be done to look at the city's infrastructure. So Mayor Duffy started something called Project Green, where he was systematically analyzing block by block what parts of the town or viable, where you might only have one house still standing and maybe you need to buy that person out or pick up the house and move it to a block where there were enough houses to have a viable block, and at a certain point saying no more infrastructure for that block, or that block becomes a park or an urban farm. Detroit has gone a long way with the planned shrinkage. I think these cities don't want to get too caught up in we're a planned shrinkage community. We're going to be smaller from here on in. They're just saying, let's take the land that has ceased to have value, homes that are really dilapidated, and make some better use of them, even if it doesn't mean a populated place. And let's, for now, be a smaller place, but let's use our land in a better way. And who knows what'll happen later. But I think it's a strategic approach to looking at the communities, in some cases block by block. Detroit's doing it 20 or 30 acres at a time.
I would agree, and IBM's coming to town to work with the city of Syracuse on a vacant lot study, which we're excited to see how IBM can contribute analytically to what our vacant lot situation. It's nowhere near as severe as it is in Buffalo, but that's where I think, and when Paul mentioned this, the land banking apparatus will be advantageous to us, and we're looking forward to see that legislation advance at the state level, because we're not planning a retreat necessarily. We do have a vacant lot issue, and that the land bank will be a key component of managing that in a better way.
Anything else? Okay. I think one of the keys there, too, is not to get caught up on the language. Smart growth, smart decline, it really is capturing the investments in the most strategic way to get the outcomes you want. There's a question, how does a municipality encourage private developers to invest in privately owned, underutilized asphalt? Matt?
Privately owned, underutilized, what?
Asphalt.
Oh, underperforming asphalt, which you missed Ellen's presentation.
Oh, I missed it.
Gray fields, kind of empty commercial strip malls from the 70s.
Oh, this man.
Oh yeah, I meant the developer guy.
I was like, I have no idea.
Good question. Right, that's a really tough one. I mean, the reason why it's tough is because the market has to be there to support development, and if there's no market to do that, it's kind of hard to. I mean, it's like that's a difficult thing. So, I mean, one of the things that I think we're trying to do in certain smaller towns around New Jersey, for example, is again going back to this predictability thing and making sure that everything is in place in terms of legislation, regulation, and incentives, whatever you can possibly do, so that if there is an inkling of market, you can attract that market to these places, right? It's a little bit easier, obviously, if the city owns the land, because you can, do an RFP and do it well and attract the right kind of developer. But on privately owned pieces of land, it's a little different. We're working in this. The other thing about privately owned pieces of land is that the landowner, you're kind of it's up to the whims of the landowner, right? And so lots of times the landowner, I've seen this more than once. For some reason, these landowners that are like 80-year-olds that have had it forever and they got it for nothing always think that they're sitting on a gold mine, even though the gold never materializes, right? And so I don't have a very good answer for that, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just a couple of things. One thing that Washington, D.C. does is we have a pretty steep tax on vacant properties.
Yeah.
So that it becomes actually costly to hold on. And so you'd better hope that gold appears, because it isn't no cost to the community to have a blighted property sitting in the middle of the community. It does create impacts on surrounding property owners and on obviously the city's tax base. The other thing that actually your colleague told me about yesterday was that some places have development rights that expire in a certain amount of time. So if I have 3 years in which I have a fair amount of density available to me to put on, it limits the speculation. As I near the end of that clock, I'm going to get nervous about having to go back through the process and seeing whether I can get a development on there or not.
But that requires a transaction, that initial transaction to have occurred within a time frame that that legislation can be put in place, right? So if you have a landowner that holds property for 20 years, like, you can't really go in and apply those tools necessarily.
Well, you can certainly change the tax rate for vacant properties at any time, and I believe Maryland, when Governor Glendening was governor, was looking at sunsetting different development rights.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if they...
In New York, I don't think we'd have that authority, but we do have a vacant property registration program here, and it's a fee, but the fee has to be kind of commensurate with legitimate expenses that the city incurs. So I know that there are other programs where they ratcheted up the fee for every successive year it was vacant. We can't do that unless the municipality can show that you've actually incurred additional cost. One thing I will mention is the Brownfield Opportunity Area Program, and maybe Paul Byer left, right? Okay. But that is an opportunity where you can maybe work with an entire area, neighborhood area, that has a lot of suspected brownfield sites or underutilized sites, vacant sites. And through that long process, it's 3 steps. You can actually work with the landowners or the property owners, pull them in, do the community visioning so that the redevelopment of that site isn't just isolated in a vacuum, but it's actually done within a much larger neighborhood area. The city has 3 of those BOAs ongoing, and the county administers one at the Brandywine, and they also have one over in Johnson City, the EJ Spine. So there's, again, a lot of great activity going on in that area that's already existing, and we hope to take advantage of those in the coming years.
That actually made me want to talk just a little briefly about, because another method that seems to be working in Newark is more of a grassroots effort, right? Where there's a community development corporation that's in this neighborhood where this sort of blighted, underused property exists, and they went and found resources to hire a planner, us, to conduct a community visioning process to imagine the redevelopment and reuse of that site. And so that way, what happened then is we developed we did some financial feasibility on how that site could be redeveloped, and we created a really interesting visual presentation for what could happen. We also garnered the resources of the community itself to imagine interim uses on the site that wouldn't cost the existing property owner anything, but would actually start, so for like markets, we might even do a little bit of urban agriculture on the site. It doesn't cost the owner anything. If the owner doesn't have any risk on it, he's like, fine, whatever. And it starts to develop and generate some buzz around the site. And then, the other piece of this is we then go to the landowner with an actual proposal for how he might redevelop the site, right? Lots of times I don't think these landowners actually have, first of all, if they're getting a lot of passive income off of the thing, there's really no incentive for them to do anything creative or thoughtful about it, right? So if you can bring them something that says, hey, look, your property is underperforming economically in addition to being a really bad thing for this community. And if we do a few things that are very low risk that could increase your income, why wouldn't you do that? So that's more of a grassroots thing.
I want to transition there to a question. I mean, a lot of this has been talking about kind of paradigm shifts and how we invest our transportation dollars, our land use, our zoning regs, but still what I don't think hasn't been mentioned much really is economic development paradigm. And that the traditional old way of doing it is to basically lure a business from somewhere else, either in the region or outside the region, to that area, not creating overall economic vitality in the nation, but just stealing jobs. Then there's the idea of clustering, but also what role of just growing your own, economic gardening, localism. If they're the majority of our job or source of our jobs that are created, how does a municipality change that shift? How can does an IDA play a role in that? Some of our other traditional economic development tools, can they shift to assist this localism?
I want to jump in there because there's going to be an opportunity here in this region that's brought about by Governor Cuomo's announcement. There'll be regional economic development councils. And while we're all waiting to see how that actually rolls out, presumably at some point, maybe in the next month or two, Lieutenant Governor Duffy will announce a meeting somewhere in this area in Broome County, Madison, somewhere around here. We're not sure exactly how the regions include Binghamton and Broome. And I think that's the time when people here in Binghamton need to let the Lieutenant Governor know that you'd rather see the effort go to retention of existing jobs and supporting local efforts that grow organically and grow naturally here in this community. But particularly, you don't want to see IDAs, which use public funds, moving companies from Binghamton to Greenfield, somewhere between Binghamton and God knows where. That's not the best use of the funds. It's cannibalization. And I think that there are a lot of economic development tax credit programs used in the state that should be told, yeah, you can give a subsidy to a company in a greenfield, but it's going to be a lot less than the subsidy you would give to a company in a brownfield. And if that brownfield is a parcel right near downtown, that's where the greatest subsidy is allowed. So a differential rate of subsidization. I think that when Lieutenant Governor Duffy comes here and the ESDC comes talking about regional economic development councils, assert what's in the interest of the density and the needs of this community, if that's how you see it.
Exactly. We've got a long way to go on that, I think, and it's refreshing. The governor's refreshing on this front with the councils. Lieutenant Governor Duffy is, and even Ken Adams. I think Ken Adams, who's now in charge of ESDC, formerly in charge of the Business Council, recognizes that inefficiency. And Paul and I lived through that with Beechnut moving to Florida, but Florida in, is it Madison County? I think near Amsterdam. If you drive down the thruway to Albany now, you'll see the empty Beechnut facility in Canajoharie. And they're bankrupting Canajoharie by that move, which kept Beechnut in New York, which was very important to the Empire State Development Corporation. But at the time they did that, there was absolutely no plan on what they were going to do to support Canajoharie when that facility moved out. And we were all called into the governor's office to triage that after the decision had been made and after the announcement had been made. And the mayor called up and said, well, guys, what about us? We just upgraded our wastewater treatment plant to support Beechnut for another 20 years, and they owed the corporation that I worked for $4 million to pay for it. So we still have some very problematic approaches to this. And as I mentioned, my portfolio, having just about everything I needed to be a really cool, smart guy in Onondaga County, the one I'm missing is economic development. And they're still very much out there in a different plane, working with IDAs and giving those incentives to steal from Peter to pay Paul however they can. But we're very fortunate to have a great organic, local center state CEO that's done a tremendous job growing businesses, and we are fighting to retain our businesses, particularly our big ones. Like Binghamton with IBM, we had Carrier Corporation, they're gone. So it's a new paradigm, and Canajoharie is a very sad story.
To leave a positive note on that, we have an example of how investing and supporting our local entrepreneurs. We have a representative from VMR here, who's New York State Small Business of the Year recipient. And so went from a few jobs in their basement to almost 300 jobs now here in the city of Binghamton, North Side. It's just an incredible effort. So really the power is in cultivating local innovation, supporting our locally independent-owned businesses.
Just one quick comment on that. I mean, just from a physical standpoint, I think your comment about starting in the basement speaks to cheap space and the availability of cheap space where different startups, just basic incubator space. I think that is also something that can be pretty powerful in helping locals start up. Access to a lot of the economic development also tends to sort of focus on the brass ring of medium or large size businesses. I think just more of a focus on the small businesses, the startups, helping them with business plans, with incubator space, getting in touch with other folks, providing some common back office even for some of them. Those are the kinds of things that might help to home grow more businesses so that they do become hundreds of jobs rather than 3 or 4 in a basement.
Right. And Broome County does have an incubator, so it has been very helpful in that. I just got one that it was specific to the smart growth, and since Paul is gone, I'm going to maybe hold on to this. Maybe we can talk afterwards with Peter to see. Maybe one last question here. Before we do that, we'll finish a little early because it has been a long day, and there is wine and beer next door, so I must be getting really boring. I just want to say a few things, a little housekeeping before the last question. One, videos, all of these will be online. Definitely want to thank Wilton and Stefan. They agreed to do this at a highly discounted rate just because they're very committed. So. The wine networking reception is happening right out here. They basically said use the space until you're done talking. So there's no rush. Feel free to relax. We will send a survey to all of the attendees at today's symposium. It will literally take 5 minutes. We did sample. And basically, it's very helpful to get your feedback so the LCA can really figure out what are the next steps. How do we move from an informal alliance to maybe institutionalizing it, taking advantage of really some of our regional planning boards? And finally, in the spirit of sustainability, please, Amelia would kill me if I forgot to say this, please drop off your badges when you leave at the registration table. We will reuse the plastic, okay? And then finally, can we just give a really warm applause to all of our panelists who we nagged them with emails and phone calls. Some of them really agreed to some challenging travel arrangements, so we appreciate you coming. Last question, just because I think this really speaks to future vision and how we need to make sure we're making the right choices or balanced choices. Given that in Broome County there has been an outmigration of 30 and 40-year-olds due to the lack of jobs, we are left with a senior citizenry baby boomer majority. Shouldn't we be concentrating on senior citizen housing rather than student housing downtown? There are 3 big student housing projects going on downtown, so someone maybe want to tackle that one. Planner at the table?
I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, as long as they're not restrictive in their rentals. I think they're very similar housing types, actually. They want walkable communities, they want services nearby, they want access to entertainment, they want access to culture. I don't think it's, as long as it's not exclusive housing, I don't think it's an issue, really. I think they could be very complementary.
I think it was a good question to finish with, because I also think it reflects that, you know, we still need a lot of work. We have to do a lot of advocacy so we can make the right forms. We might have missed the opportunity at the city to use the tax pilot as a leverage, maybe to incentivize inclusionary zoning, make sure we have affordable housing, that it doesn't have to be just student housing. But there are a lot of different creative tools. If we're going to use the public resources, invest in our community, we want to make sure that we get the greatest return. With that being said, I want to thank Mary McFadden for doing an excellent job emceeing. And if anyone is interested in learning more about the LCA, feel free to stop over, talk to any of us. We'd be happy to talk to you. And thank you all for coming. It's been a long day, but really appreciate your attention and commitment.